Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. Despite where you are in the world, it is great to have you with us this afternoon for the third episode of season 2 of the Inclusion Exchange. Really offering you a huge welcome today as you're joining us. If you've not been along before, my name is Ayo Bali. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Managing Director and Senior Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Practitioner at Bakri Bali. And we are essentially an organisation that helps workplaces and individuals to move forward to be more inclusive through the way that they develop their strategies, the way they recruit, and the way that they support staff as well. When I set up the business, I really wanted to establish ways for people within organisations, whether it be you're a chief exec, a staff network lead, an employee, an HR professional, just a way for people to come together and to meet regularly to find out what's working and what's not in advancing inclusion, and to really hear from professionals, individuals and experts who are really doing some of this work in a number of different sectors. So this is really a way of platforming excellence within the sector and hearing new perspectives and hopefully challenging all of our thinking around how we can progress inclusion in the workplace. So really great to have you along to this episode. Really happy to particularly have the episode today because this is part of our National Inclusion Week celebrations at Bakri Bali. We really wanted to do something special. So we're really delighted to have an inclusion exchange specifically looking at the link between workplace wellbeing and equity, diversity and inclusion to ensure that a variety of people's voices are heard within wellbeing, and that when we're looking at staff wellbeing, we're really looking at it from a perspective of those who've historically been marginalised, who may actually, from a social justice approach, need that wellbeing support the most. So really excited to have a discussion and a dialogue with our guest today about that. So for those of you who don't know our guest, I'm just going to share a little bit of information about him. So we've got Lee Chambers joining us today. Really feel privileged to have Lee along with us. I've been working on having this conversation for a couple of months, so really happy he said yes and was willing to come on and have a chat with us today. So for those of you who don't know, Lee is an award-winning British psychologist and founder of Essentialised Workplace Wellbeing. He is a National Academy of Sciences Kavli Fellow and was inducted into the Black Cultural Archives in 2022 for services to business and health, which is absolutely amazing. He's been featured in Medical News Today and on the BBC. He's highly regarded for his work on health inequalities and inclusive workplaces, and he speaks internationally on a range of topics relating to wellbeing and inclusion, and is also the author of The Millennial's Guide to Wellness. And I know Lee's got another book in the pipeline as well, which hopefully he'll be able to tell us a bit about today. He's the winner of the Great British Entrepreneur Award, and his company featured in this year's Startup 100 Index and UK Small Business 100. Lee is openly autistic, and he shares his journey to challenge the status quo and inspire the next generation of neurodivergent scientists, entrepreneurs and change makers. So without further ado, welcome Lee. It's so nice to have you with us. Please do come on board. Oh, good to see your face. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Ion. Thank you for having me on today.
Oh no, it's a pleasure. Can't wait to have this discussion. So Lee, I met you at an evening event probably a couple of months ago. I see that you're at lots of different award ceremonies, but I feel like there's so much more to know about you. I know that you're from Bolton, I believe, which is where my sister lives. I know that you do so much in this space and particularly have a passion for allyship and advocacy. But for our listeners who perhaps haven't met you or have seen certain bits about you, I'd love to just start off the session really just to find out a bit more about your origin story, how you actually got into this space, a little bit about you, what motivates you as a person, really, just to give us a flavour for who you are. So
yeah. No, thank you, Ayo. So I mean, it's been a journey, no doubt. So yeah, I started life in Bolton and was born and brought up there. Born in the 80s, and my parents were teenagers when they had me, so I was a bit of a surprise. I was always a curious child, always asked lots of questions. I had a very kind of, how should we say, a very young passion for social justice, which would get me into some really interesting conversations and also get me into a little bit of trouble. as I might, I was occasionally kind of known for going, meting out my own version of social justice on those who I felt were oppressing others, which, yeah, I've learned lessons from that definitely over the years. But no, I was the first one in my extended family to go to university studying business and psychology. That was a real privilege. There's also quite a lot of pressure. So yeah, no, to pick up, obviously I was the first one in my extended family to university. A lot of pressure, quite a privilege. Actually struggled quite a bit and found myself dropping out due to poor mental health in my second year. Spent a year at home working on myself. And I suppose in some ways that's where a passion for wellbeing actually started through my own struggles over 20 years ago now. But then I kind of managed to work on myself and kind of, learn or become a bit more self-aware and a bit more emotionally intelligent. Get back to university and graduate, which was, kind of validation that you can go through some challenges and come out of the other side. I managed to actually get on a graduate scheme in corporate finance at a national bank in Manchester, which was seen as a real achievement. But then I lost that role in the recession in 2008 and ended up having to start again. So kind of back home wondering what to do. Kind of took me on the next part of my journey, which was working in local government to kind of, just survive, but then using that as a platform to build a video game business, which I grew over the next 5 years. Learned an awful lot about, being a leader, managing teams, and trying to, steer a ship in my mid-20s with not that much life experience. You learn an awful lot when you put in those situations quite young. And still to this day, the discomfort of having to learn, having to make decisions with little information that impacted many livelihoods really fuels the work that I do today. But I think the biggest turning point for me into this journey was when I became ill in 2014. My immune system failed. I had to learn to walk again. And, through that experience, I managed to, appreciate that actually the version of success that I'd been chasing, that I'd been kind of shown by society, wasn't my version of success. And actually, I hadn't been grateful for walking until I lost it. So, having an 11-month journey to get back on my feet, alongside my newborn daughter, I was determined to get back on my feet before she started walking so I could take her first steps with her. And I managed that. And it's like a memory ever emblazoned on my mind. The reality is she's 9 next week, and I've not beat her at much else since. So at least I've got, that memory to reminisce on as she continues to run rings around me. But managing that chronic illness and coming out the other side, I decided actually to not return to my business operationally, but take a strategic role and take some time to recover and reflect. I used that time to become a stay-at-home dad and started to see a very different world in parent and baby and parent and toddler groups, and hear stories that made me think, why wasn't I aware of this? Kind of hearing about maternity discrimination, what it was like for a lot of the grandmothers being the first generation of women in the workplace. And, I went and completed my master's during that period as well, and started to really think, how can I build something that actually, makes a difference, creates a legacy every day? Because obviously when you're seriously ill, it does give you very much a wake-up call for, if you don't come out of the other side, what might be left behind. So yeah, that's kind of fueled the past 3 years. I launched Essentialized just before the pandemic started. But in some ways, running a startup when the whole world is upside down is not such a bad thing, because as a startup, everything is upside down anyway. But it has kind of taken me into this place where I've started to kind of combine my passion for social justice that I've had since I was a child, the discomfort that I had leading an organization, understanding what it's like to run a business and be in those positions, and be looking at how we apply these things in real life scenarios alongside my kind of educational background too. So it's kind of fusing all those together, and really that's come to a place where I'm very passionate about well-being. I'm very passionate about inclusion. I'm very passionate about how we bring those two together to make better health outcomes for everyone, and really create opportunities for people to be well in workplaces, which are generally the most diverse places where we're connected into.
Wow, there's so much within there, Lee. I had no idea about. I didn't know about what happens with your autoimmune system and Wow, yeah, a lot of resilience and like you say, a lot of life experience that can actually take you in lots of different directions. So thanks for sharing that. Learn a lot about you from that. So it kind of explains a little bit about the passion that I see on a daily basis through a lot of the content that you create. And what I love about kind of following you, I suppose, is the focus on allyship. We talked a little bit before we came on about active allyship. So have you? I'm just curious, I suppose, in terms of the story that you've just shared. Was allyship a part of that? Was it because of allies that you were able to progress?
Yeah.
Experiences of allyship, I suppose I'm asking.
Yes. So firstly, I thought my first experience of allyship was when I was at primary school. So I kind of suffered quite a lot at the hands of one boy who, felt it was okay to racially abuse me on a daily basis. And, fundamentally, that was pretty tough. Growing up in Bolton, there were very, very few black children. Because there's only a few black families who settled there in the 80s. But this one boy, I mean, my father knew his father and uncle and family, and his behaviours were coming from his family, not ultimately the fact that he wasn't well behaved. But yeah, basically the first allyship that I really got was when this was reported to the head teacher of the primary school I was at. She actively engaged parents, engaged teachers, engaged the vicar of the school, and kind of went to the community and actively worked to kind of reduce the racism or, racial abuse I was facing, to a point where actually it almost went. And like reflecting back now, she was white, she was, coming towards the end of her. I mean, ultimately she passed away before I left primary school. So, she was, an amazing woman, but that was the first time reflecting back that I had and saw active allyship, and the impact it had on my life as a young boy was absolutely massive. And obviously other times as well, I saw the impact of, when I became ill, how people stepped in to support me in a range of different ways. And, how again, they didn't have that lived experience of not being able to walk, and they didn't know what that might feel like, but they were able to empathize and be humble enough to look for ways to actively support me. And I kind of look at my journey through every struggle that I've had, through the redundancy, through mental health issues, through physical health issues, through racism. And every time at some point, someone has stepped in and been an active ally. And it's easy to look and think, wow, Lee, you've been through a lot. You've been through all this adversity. You've triumphed. You must be so resilient. But the truth is, I've always had someone there. I've always had a support network. I've always had, some form of allyship that has helped me to, lift my way out of the pitfalls that I've fallen in my life. And when every single one of us reflects on that, we'll probably see those patterns in our own lives too. And that's such a good reason, and sometimes such a good fuel for us to think about how we can be that ally for others.
Thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. Absolutely. So I want to ask you a question. I think you've touched on there that sense of community, the fact that we're not, it's difficult to get through on our own actually, and workplaces are where we spend a lot of our time, a lot of our day. And actually that relationship that we got with our manager or our team members can actually have a big impact on our level of resilience, particularly when difficult challenges happen within the workplace. I often share a statistic that I've heard previously around the fact that I think it's about 80% of disabilities occur with people who are over 18. So it's kind of within adulthood, a lot of disabilities develop. So sometimes you're dealing with situations that perhaps you hadn't predicted, they come out of the blue, and you're in a situation where you're in work and you're trying to balance that. So given what you've set up with Essentialize, I'm just curious to know a little bit more about how you view workplace well-being as a concept. What does it mean? Why is it important in the workplace? And why is it relevant, particularly in today's society where we've been through COVID? We've got a National Health Service, which is really struggling in terms of frontline staff, in terms of their own well-being, never mind patients' well-being. So just tell me a little bit more about your views on what workplace well-being is and why it's relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting topic, AO. I mean, I think it's always important to kind of consider where things started and where things originated. And the ideas around workplace wellbeing are actually over 50 years old. And it was Johnson & Johnson in 1979 who kind of created the Fit for Life program. And that was the first kind of workplace wellbeing program that was implemented. Obviously, they started with that in the States, but it's really funny how not much really happened around workplace wellbeing for another, probably 35 years after that. It actually started to really pick up in the United States, especially during the recession. The same recession that, spat me out and made me redundant was a recession that made a lot of American businesses realize our healthcare costs from a business perspective are going through the roof. Is there something we can do from a preventative basis to actually save ourselves some money? So, I mean, the workplace wellbeing as an industry actually started as a money-saving exercise, not as a caring about people's health outcomes exercise. Fast forward 15 years, and it has grown, it's morphed, it's evolved in so many different ways. But, the industry today is quite interesting. It's still very focused on solutions. I'm very much more focused on, how we can make work a net positive for everyone. Because, we go to work, we put effort in, we spend quite a lot of time doing it. It's not always fun. It's not always, the thing that we would want to do with our time. But work should be a net promoter of positivity overall for people. For the energy that they put in, they also get, energy and well-being outcomes out of the other side. It impacts so many different things in the world today, from retention to performance, to how people behave and interact together, to collaboration and innovation. And fundamentally, when people are well, they are able to not only achieve more in the workplace, but they actually form deeper bonds with other people. They're able to create those connections. We've got a massive challenge with loneliness as a society. When people are well, they're much more compelled to connect to themselves and to connect to others. And yeah, I mean, the industry itself is very, very spread. There's technology-based things, there's insurance-based aspects, there's practitioner and medical-based aspects. There's aspects that are much more people-focused and very kind of the idea around learning and development aspects around how to build well-being as a set of skills to help you with your health outcomes. I mean, there's so much out there. I mean, my perspective on it, at the minute, it's such a young industry. There's a lot out there. The efficacy on a lot of things is questionable. There's a lot of things that are driven by commerciality, which mean that things like accessibility, engagement, functionality, trust and safety are not at the forefront because, financial outcomes and, investors have put quite a lot of money into certain companies in this space. And that creates a set of expectations and targets around acquiring customers rather than actually prioritizing health and well-being outcomes on the other side. But I suppose for us, it's about doing what we do in a way that actually, embeds well-being, looks at some of the barriers, looks at things, the foundational aspects, work design, ways of working, management capability and competency on these challenges, how leadership role model these behaviors, and really looking at, what are the barriers? How are values lived and played out within organizations? Are people fundamentally treated in a fair and equitable way? Because for all the fancy things you can do, yoga on a Friday, fruit bowls, fancy apps, people are not going to engage in these things if they don't fundamentally trust, if they don't feel like a semblance of belonging to what they're doing, and they don't actually find any joy and connection in their work. So we kind of look at it upstream rather than trying to pull people out of the river before they fall off the waterfall. We're literally looking at the bridges that are broken and thinking, how can we start to fix those?
Interesting. And I think you touched on it in your answer there, but I think I'm curious to know your perspective. Obviously, it's a relatively young industry in terms of well-being. You mentioned 50 so years. You've also mentioned there that people have different kind of experiences, and there's a need for equity within there. So when we're looking at, for instance, during COVID, and there was a heightened understanding of the disparity between the experiences of kind of working families and the additional strain that had on well-being, etc. So have you seen any particular examples where well-being has been looked at through that lens of actually who are we actually trying to support? Who requires the most support, if you like, or who? How can we provide the support in a way that's equitable and acknowledges that everyone's coming into the workplace with a different experience? Yeah, I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I mean, that obviously starts with being able to, get qualitative and quantitative data about what people's specific challenges are.
Mm.
And obviously, that's kind of an integral part of actually building a wellbeing strategy that looks to benchmark, where an organization is currently at, what specific challenges and barriers certain groups are facing, so that they can strategically plan to look to how they can make a difference for those particular groups. So, fundamentally, before bringing in solutions, actually taking that time to understand where we are, what the challenges are, what the barriers are, and how we can tailor solutions that will actually, be able to make a difference, and then how we assess the difference that they've made. Because again, there's an experimental aspect as well.
Bless you.
Oh, having a moment there. Yeah, there's an experimental aspect as well, where with it being such a young industry, we're still kind of learning and understanding a lot of how around kind of initiatives and interventions work in workplace contexts too. But I suppose the thing for me is it's kind of understanding that there are a lot of one size fits all solutions that companies are trying to apply,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
simply it's disheartening because it will make it appear that it doesn't work, and then companies are less likely to continue to put budget into investing in the things that can make a difference. I mean, some of the things don't even take a budget in the first place, but they need someone who's in a position to look at it very strategically, because a big part of well-being in an organization is culture change work. It's
Mm-hmm.
longer term transformational culture change work. It's not turn up, do a few events, and everyone's going to leave and have a skill set to look after themselves. Because, we all have significant challenges. Those challenges can be very different. And that's not taking into account the fact that, like we said before, marginalized communities, we have so many multifaceted issues. There's a lack of trust in the healthcare systems that have, systemically discriminated against us and put us in places where, we've simply not been prioritized. The research hasn't been done. The funding's never been there. And some of the actions of the past have created, a place where it doesn't feel like your health outcomes are valued. So that then makes a case for people then feeling, well, why should I value my health? There are so many challenges. I kind of look at it from sometimes, and a lot of the work that I do looks at it from a gender lens. The lack of funding into, women's hormonal health over the years, it just doesn't really make any sense when you take it and strip it back. But it does create significant challenges because awareness of these topics, because they've been stigmatized by society, means that, the understanding is not there, and businesses are very early on the journey of understanding, aspects around, say, menopause and menstruation and how that impacts well-being outcomes, because that impacts 51% of the global population directly and 100% of the population indirectly. Because whether it's your partner, it's your colleague, it's friends, it's family, you're in that place where you're surrounded by people who are going through this. And, as a man, unless you're on medication which, puts you into that place, you won't be. So that's why I'm so passionate about getting us to look. And if I look at the wellbeing industry, being honest, it's very privileged. The people creating the products and services are coming at it from quite a privileged place. Usually quite one-dimensionally. The tech teams that are kind of designing the top level, services and programs are generally from higher socioeconomic classes, usually very Eurocentric in their approach, and their investors are usually even more. So in that very, high percentile bracket for privilege across all intersections. So it just kind of compounds the fact that it almost feels like some of these products are designed for those people who literally have the capacity to just be able to engage in them. They're not working 3 jobs. They're not, navigating everyday discrimination and microaggressions. They've got space to go and tap around on this app and find a solution that kind of sounds like them, looks like them. So yeah, I'm very passionate and quite outspoken in the industry, which probably gets me into, like I said, as a kid. I'm also now in interesting conversations, but also, sometimes marginalize myself and put on the naughty step for being too vocal about an industry that is still learning and growing and very young.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And I think, it's about how we can highlight that, I suppose, and sometimes a bit of disruption and highlighting it, positively can help things progress in a way that just widens the gate for other people to start benefiting from well-being. So are there any examples of initiatives that you've seen have actually turned things perhaps on their head and looked at it from an individual perspective, or particularly groups who perhaps historically or traditionally wouldn't access wellbeing support? Are there any of those innovations actually happening where certain initiatives have been set up for that purpose to reach groups that perhaps wouldn't necessarily benefit from overarching strategies?
Yeah, so I mean, what's interesting is to see some of the things that are happening in terms of, firstly, how to engage these groups. Because obviously, your typical communications are generally, they're not very well targeted. And it's about, how do you actually look at some of the challenges that these groups have and communicate that, what is being offered can be for them. We'll look at the things around culturally sensitive and responsive interventions. And, there are companies who are leading the charge in actually looking, how do we provide these spaces for people to discuss these things in a culturally sensitive way that often requires some external facilitation or skill sets of people who actually, do understand and have cultural competency as, one of the things that they can actually bring to that conversation. But those have been really powerful in shaping strategies that are multifaceted rather than one-dimensional. But it's even down to kind of looking at, we work with a company who made an active effort to look, how do they engage the nighttime workforce? Because, they are transient, more diverse than the daytime workforce. And looking and realizing that from a wellbeing perspective, pretty much everything they did was during the day. So they were actively excluding a decent part of the workforce just by oversight and not thinking about how they would engage. So they actively created wellbeing activities for the night shift workers, for the ones who run the road. So they created like wellbeing depot things overnight. And also wellbeing activities that fit within the schedule during the evening. And it's like, it's quite easy to exclude people when you don't consider how diverse a workforce might be. I mean, there's so many little examples that have been good about, how you engage men in conversations around mental health, because, stereotypically there's still aspects around not engaging in certain types of language, but when it's suddenly framed as performance coaching, men were a lot more likely to come and have a therapy session. And there's so many different, facets, but it's just, there needs to be that fundamental understanding there of some of the different barriers and actually, actively working over time, not just kind of one thing and that's it. Like we said before, there is like an aspiration to execution gap that I see in pretty much every organization. And leadership sometimes is like, we want to do something, but we don't know what. Or they start to say they're doing something, but don't actually follow through on it. And that's really damaging to trust. And fundamentally, I owe so much of it comes from actually listening. Because sometimes people don't know what the barriers are themselves. But we've got to look at things holistically and appreciate that, intersectionality plays out in terms of privilege to access well-being. And you might have someone in the workforce, they've got a level of privilege which allows them space to actively engage in lots of things. Whereas some people are in a place where, they might have sort of caregiving responsibilities, financial well-being challenges, because well-being isn't just mental health. It's physical, it's financial, it's emotional, it's social, it's intellectual. It's really wide-ranging. But fundamentally, it all comes down to making work a better place for everyone. And that's why inclusion and equity and belonging is so deeply tied towards well-being.
Thank you so much in there. Really enjoying the discussion, and I hope everyone else is as well. I'm busily taking notes here of different aspects of that. I want to move the conversation on a little bit, Lee, kind of more focused on yourself, your own experience. In the introduction, I mentioned that you're an openly autistic man. So I want to know, and I'd be interested to know, what some of the major misconceptions that you've heard or experienced around neurodiversity, and also how can an improved focus on neurodiversity in the workplace specifically improve well-being experiences for everyone, because I imagine a lot of the changes actually would improve all of our well-being if we look at things through a neurodiversity lens. But I'm really curious to get your insight on that based on your own observations.
Yeah, so I mean, it's such an interesting and wide-ranging topic. So I mean, the first thing we have to say is, in terms of research on neurodivergent conditions, it was almost exclusively done on young, white, relatively privileged boys until the past 5 years. So our whole understanding, conceptualization, diagnosis schema, and structures around what things such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia are based off one small subset of the population. So it's only now we're uncovering this like Pandora's box of realizing, well, it doesn't just manifest in one small subset of the population. It's a pretty much universal human thing. So, you know, the conversations that we're having about this at the minute, you know, it's prevalence in women, its prevalence in marginalized groups where, you know, if we look at how the media's portrayed it, it's always been, you know, Rain Man with, you know, remembering a million facts, or some young child who's non-verbal and doesn't speak and can only communicate through different means. It's like there's so many, you know, every neurodivergent individual is unique. You've met one neurodivergent individual, you've met one. But yeah, I need to keep a little bit more focus in this. So what is it? It's a difference, it's a variation, and we kind of have to take it from how it's been defined in the world today. It was always defined from a very medical perspective. So it was seen as, you know, a disorder. It was seen as like a deficit. It was kind of deeply tied into learning disabilities. And it was almost at times seen as a disease that could be cured. But it's none of those. It's not a deficit, it's not a disorder, and it's definitely not a disease that can be cured. It's a difference. It's a variation. It's, you know, ultimately neurodivergent individuals see the world and navigate the world in a different way. And it is a difference. And I've kind of heard people suggest that it's not dissimilar to being left-handed in a world where almost everything's designed for right-handed people.
Right.
And, you know, that difference means that, you know, whether it's social, communication, sensory, thinking, and kind of cognition styles, those can be different in neurodivergent individuals. And the typical expectations that we have and the very kind of normalized expectations around what these concepts of how we socialize, our sensory tolerances, how we pick up signals from our body, are all, you know, standardized, and yet neurodivergent individuals are likely to be different than the standard. But I suppose the way I'd like everyone to imagine it is neurodivergent individuals have like bigger spikes and deeper pitfalls for the skills overall. So you take, you know, neurotypical individuals who are all unique as well, and they'll tend to have, you know, variances in like skills such as like time management and pattern recognition, and it'll form like if you kind of take like the normal average expected, you know, ability to operate in those areas, people will be above the line, below the line, and your typical person will kind of have a graph that's a little bit spiky, whereas neurodivergent individuals are likely to have a more spiky line across all those skills, because there are some things neurodivergent individuals find incredibly easy, almost like seamless, where other people can actually find those quite difficult. But also they have some areas where the challenges are deeper, and they're likely to need more support in those areas. So that's, I think, a good way to conceptualize it. And like, for example, autism, it's not a spectrum from one end to the other. It's more like a prism where you kind of sit in different areas across a whole range of strands. You're not just on a line. No one's just on a line. So yeah, kind of bringing it back to my own experiences. Obviously, ever since I was young, I knew I was different. I knew I thought differently than other people. I communicated differently. And I just saw the world, and people didn't seem to get how I saw the world. And it was difficult to explain. And I was always able to turn things into a picture for people, which was kind of how I found a way to communicate. But that also overlaid with being, a young Black boy. So I didn't fit the expectations in a lot of ways. Like, I'd be the one who was like, I want to go and play with some patterns. And the other young lad, my cousins, were like, "You want to do that for? Let's go and hang about around town." And it was like the expectations around, what being young and Black were quite different for me, because I was like, I was interested in messing about with my computer, and that wasn't what was expected. But kind of like moving forward, I didn't hear about autism until I think I was at university. It just wasn't spoken about back then. And it definitely wasn't spoken about in the community. And reflecting back on what happened to a lot of neurodivergent Black children in the 70s and 80s, I'm not surprised, given they were taken, off to these schools in the middle of nowhere and then just left to suffer, not taught properly, and just effectively society gave up on them. And I was lucky enough to be quite academic with my kind of ability to memorize facts and stuff like that. So I got by and did all right at school. But I hate to imagine for those who, suffered a very different fate, and still to this day probably feel like they're the ones who will feel the medical system. No, the systems have given up on us when we were children. Why should we believe them? And that's why there's mistrust in society. But yeah, even to this day, I only got a diagnosis 2 years ago. That diagnosis came through my son's diagnosis and the educational psychologist doing the parental interviews and saying, afterwards, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I decided to go and get diagnosed so I could, in some ways, go on that journey with my son and support him and show him what was possible against a lot of the stereotypes and negativity that still surrounds it, and kind of help him understand that, he might have some limitations and challenges, but he also will have some real strengths, and he can, hopefully thrive in a world where awareness is much higher. But to kind of answer your last point, making a more neuro-inclusive workplace actually makes the workplace better for everyone. It starts to look at those small accommodations and adjustments that neurodivergent individuals find really help them to bring their best strengths to work and have some of their challenges mitigated and minimized. But then you realize that everyone has challenges that they could do with some accommodations and adjustments for. Yeah. And when you actually create this idea around thinking about how we can design things universally for people, and these accommodations and adjustments, it's not like changing the world. It's quite often little tweaks. The same assistive technologies that we've been using to support neurodivergent individuals are now, Alexas and Google Docs, and
absolutely, yeah.
It's like these things are now everyone's using them because they benefit everyone, right? So yeah, it's a very different way to look at it, and it's not a deficit, it's not a disorder, it's not a disease. It's a difference, a variation, and can be really powerful when we create places where people can harness the strengths of that variation, and not be trying to be left-handed, and there not being any left-handed scissors.
Oh, thanks, Lee. Yeah, so insightful, and it's just got me thinking, I suppose, in terms of it being a mindset. This is a mindset shift. Like you said, it's about culture change and actually viewing everything in a way that, what can we do to make sure that everyone has access and that everyone can feel just comfortable being able to ask to do certain tasks or be in a certain environment. And it speaks about what our expectations should be within the workplace, but in wider service provision as well, whether it's healthcare or any services, really need to be set up so that they can support people of a variety of different ways of thinking and being. So yeah, thank you so much for going into so much depth on that. It's really, really useful. So I've got probably one more question for you, maybe two if we can squeeze it in. But I wanted to ask you, I suppose, a bit of a philosophical question. I think we touched on this when we first met,
Yeah.
because you were talking to me a little bit about the psychology behind inclusion. And I was interested to know, in a society where different people have different access to resources, and perhaps we're in workplaces practically where a lot of people, particularly at the moment, are facing challenges around the cost of living. Is there a link between that heightened sense of challenge in society at the moment in terms of economic challenge, etc., and our ability to really foster a sense of inclusion where we're asking people to care about other people who face even more disadvantage than we do? So I guess I want to know from your perspective, what is the psychological link between people having good sense of well-being and our ability to change workplace cultures in general to make them more inclusive? For instance, for people who have disabilities or people who are facing racial discrimination, just to get your perspective on the psychology behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really kind of deep and a deep and, yeah, like you said, philosophical question. So I think it kind of comes back to what we were saying, and something I'm quite passionate about is kind of why Essentialize looks at the gap between wellbeing and inclusion, is because they are cyclical. And what we kind of found is that when people are included, they feel like they belong, and belonging is the biggest factor currently for people's reported well-being that drives well-being outcomes. But what's really interesting is if you look at people who report high well-being outcomes, they behave more inclusively towards other people. So fundamentally, when people are well, they become more inclusive, and then people become more inclusive and generate more belonging within others. And that belonging is the biggest factor for improving well-being in the workplace. So, well-being heightens inclusion, and then inclusion fosters more belonging, and then more belonging fosters more well-being. So it's very, very cyclical. But what breaks that cycle? Things such as bullying, continuous discrimination, continued lack of equity. And we live in such an unequal society. It's shocking. And I know that you kind of wanted me to kind of like think about that wider perspective about, like, from a historical perspective, really, is this just a human thing? Do we always need someone below us to actually feel like we're succeeding at life and we're making progress? It's a great question. I mean, if we kind of look through history, there is absolutely no doubt that some societies have actively perpetuated systems of oppression, exploitation, and inequality to make sure that was the case. Mm-hmm. You've got to look at humanity honestly and realize that, some societies have just reveled within these systems, and we have all these hierarchies and structures within our lives that we've built. Fundamentally, we built those, right? So it's like you look at it and you think, geez, that must be a human thing. We must almost want to do that, be programmed to do that, or be purposely influenced to do that. I mean, I suppose I'd like to say that there's lots of examples, but I don't think that's fundamentally how humans have to or will always be. I think that's a kind of look about how different tribes would come together to tackle big challenges. I mean, we're still kind of trying to understand aspects of evolution and plug them together. And even our own history sometimes is blinded by the same systems that exist today, right? Whose type of history we're learning and writing about, and who got documented and who didn't. Yeah, that's another great topic to discuss. But I think fundamentally what we see, the kind of the drive for social justice, and, it's easy to look at not advocating for those who have less because, well, there's so many people who have more than I have, and I should want to drive to succeed. And, we look at the systems, colonialism, hypercapitalism, patriarchy, all those systems are kind of focused around looking forward and never considering the people behind. So we do live in a very individualized society that perpetrates those things. But also, I suppose my thing is, if we were all programmed in that way, and that was a human destiny, we wouldn't have anyone working on social justice. We wouldn't have anyone working on closing, the inequality gap. We wouldn't have anyone actively working to foster equity in spaces, where it was needed more than it was needed for the individual themselves. And, in this work, we have to almost remain hopeful that people will continue to actually not be stuck in the game where people are played off against each other and people are, there's purposeful creating of scarcity around people's resource so that they focus on each other rather than actually focus on working to dismantle the systems that have caused that in the first place. I mean, that might be more of the challenge about how do we actually change, because that communication is massively prevalent in our polarized society, and it's very easy to pit people against each other rather than actually get them together to collaborate and work at the system. But we used to be able to do that when times were incredibly challenging as tribes. We can still do that today as a global society. So yeah, I'm hopeful is the answer to that question.
Thank you, Lee. And sorry to throw a big question like that in. Just always curious from my own university days and talk of the underclass. And do we always need someone that's less privileged than us to progress? Is that part of the problem? So thank you for your reflection on that. So I've had a question through from Sarah. So thanks for asking a question. Sarah would like you to describe a practical intervention that you've seen, Lee, or a programme that's been implemented in an organisation to improve wellbeing. So I know you've given a few examples of different types. Is there one particular one that you think would be good for people to take away as something to try or test?
Yeah, so I mean, it's such a difficult question to answer if you've not kind of looked at that baseline data about where you're currently at, because there's so many different things out there. I mean, the first thing that any organisation should do is really understand where the specific challenges are. But some of the things that I've seen that have had the biggest impact on well-being overall are not actually well-being themselves. It's things such as looking at processes and systems and how they can be made more efficient. That reduces people's workloads, which reduces people's levels of, damaging stress, which actually gives them more capacity to engage in well-being that they would choose outside the organisation. There's also aspects around looking, upskilling managers is probably one of the biggest things, to be able to have those conversations, because so many people report that, that management level is a barrier in terms of, I found that if you can get managers in a place where, number one, they have the capacity to have these conversations, number two, they have a good base level of understanding about well-being, so they can kind of give people some fundamental considerations around how they might take, their well-being, because it's not just an organization's responsibility, there's an individual responsibility as well. So I've kind of found that manager upskilling really powerful. But organizations should always really look first how they can reduce some resistance in the system, because I suppose one thing I'd like to leave everyone with is well-being is so often seen as additive. What can we add? When actually a lot of the best well-being is reductive, removing resistance to people being well. So removing some of those barriers. So, more sustainable workloads by looking for efficiencies, applying assistive technologies or small accommodations so people can work more seamlessly. Thinking about flexibility and how that can, flexibility is so important. It might be the flexibility so people can go and get the doctor's appointment they need to actually continue to have better health outcomes. So often it's looking, what can we do? Get the data to see where you're at, and that'll highlight things that you can maybe do that are either, gonna kind of push that needle forward where you're actually doing something, or where you're looking to take something away.
Lovely. Thank you. Yeah, something really practical in just the way that we look at answering that question. So thank you for sharing that, Lee. And just to say thank you very much for being part of the conversation, Lee. And thanks everyone for joining as well. I hope you've all taken as much away as I have But yeah, just thanks all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again next year. So we'll have a new programme of Inclusion Exchange podcast next year. It'll be coming back in a slightly different format. But yeah, for now, just to say happy Inclusion Week, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And thanks again, Lee. It's been lovely having you.
Yeah, thank you, Ion.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.